having completed her COVID isolation, the Prime Minister is preparing to depart for the United States. The trade mission hopes to further free trade talks as well as promote New Zealand to American tourists. So, what has she got planned, and will she get FaceTime with President Biden? The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is with us this morning. Morena, good morning.
Morena, Ryan.
How are you feeling? How are you doing?
Oh, yeah, good. I was back on deck, but just remotely at the end of last week. But it's good to be able to be back physically in the building today.
What were your symptoms like? Did you have like a hacking cough or a runny nose?
No, a bit of a cough, but probably I'd describe, and this again, just my experience, because I noticed there's a very broad spectrum and it won't be the same for everyone, but it was like a head cold that lingers. Yeah, you definitely knew you had it though, definitely.
Yeah. Well, good to have you back on board. So have you checked, because obviously you've got this trip, you're leaving today. Have you tested negative this morning? Have you had a test this morning? Like, are you negative now?
I haven't had a... Well, thank you for asking. I haven't done that recently, Ryan, because, of course, I'm able to travel with documentation that says I've had a recent infection. There are a number of points through this trip where protocols do require RAT testing, most of which I'm able to cover by having that letter. But it is fair to say, you mentioned the visits with the White House. One of the issues, and the reason why we haven't given anything firm on that at this stage, is because I believe I'm probably the only leader who's travelled in close proximity to a COVID infection. Most of the protocols we're experiencing are to try and detect rather than deal with recent infections. So that's why we've got a bit of work to go through. But as soon as we've got something to confirm there, we'll do that. What we've definitely seen is goodwill on both sides to try and make it work.
So you're definitely invited.
Oh yes, there's definitely talks around how we can make it work. That is certainly the case.
Okay, so they definitely want you to be there. It's just the COVID protocol situation that's holding. Okay, good.
COVID protocols are what we're working through. So as soon as we've got something to share, we'll share it. But look, for the rest of the trip, and I think it's probably important to make the point that it had always been designed around the really important issue of the reopening. So business engagement, trade engagements, investment and tourism. New Zealand is in a hotly contested environment for bringing tourists back right now. The United States is our third biggest by arrivals market for New Zealand. So that's a really important part of what we were intending to do regardless. So that's why we're pressing ahead.
All right, let's talk about the Australian election. You had a call, I understand, with Albanese at the weekend. How come you didn't raise the 501s?
We've spoken twice, actually. First on the night itself, as he was on his way to speak to his supporters, and then yesterday. Yesterday we talked very much around the range of things that are going on internationally. Of course, the Prime Minister-elect is heading to a Quad meeting. I'm off to the United States. We talked about the ability to meet sometime soon so that we can talk face-to-face about those issues, Ryan.
But this
you
is
will have seen, though, possibly, there was a report in The Guardian.
It's our single biggest bilateral issue. Wouldn't you think to raise it in the first meeting so they know where we are from the outset?
Well, in fact, the first discussion was about when are we going to sit down face-to-face and talk through these issues. He was elected about 5 minutes ago, Ryan, so I don't think it's unfair to first congratulate someone and say, look, when can we sit down and go through these really important matters? And as I say, there was a recent report in The Guardian where the Prime Minister-elect, at that time as he was campaigning, was asked about the 501s issue. What's clear to me is he has a really good understanding of how important this issue is for us, of where the tensions are. We've never asked Australia to stop deporting because we deport. Countries have policies where, for instance, someone has, more recently travelled into a country and sought residency where they've engaged in criminal behaviour of them being deported. The issue we have is where people have no connection, and he really seemed in that reporting to understand that issue for us.
Yeah. All right. Cost of living. The opposition says it's Bandaid economics made up on the fly. That's the National Party's take on your cost of living package, that $350 payment. Can you clarify for us exactly when you decided to go ahead with it? Because you only asked for Treasury's advice on May 5th, as I understand it, just a few weeks ago.
Oh, look, happy to track back, because you'll remember that this obviously isn't the only measure that we've undertaken around cost of living. So talks around, us anticipating what we were seeing potentially happening in our economy at the end of last year started because you'll see that 1st of April change that we made, Ryan, which increased the family tax credit. We started having talks about that at the end of last year, and that was necessary in order to get it in time, get the change made for the 1st of April.
Yeah, but that was nothing to do with the cost of living spike, Prime Minister.
I'll just finish if I can, Ryan. So that was the first change that we made that is permanent. It's not a Bandaid. That one's for good, and it's about on average $20 a week. Then you'll see that we, in March, saw what was happening as a result of the war in Ukraine at the pump. And it was around that time that we started talking about other measures. So around March that we probably started looking at various options and talking about what can we do that won't equally contribute to inflation as well.
So why did you not get the Treasury advice until 2 weeks before budget day? Seems pretty loose.
Often we will talk about and work through, so across the course of March and April, as ministers, we were talking and looking at various options. We looked overseas at some of the options. Many countries that we looked at who were having the same experience as us were doing things like the winter energy payment, which we already had. So it was very much around what can we design to take the hard edges, and we know it will not be, it is not a solution for everything, but is designed to help Kiwis get through the latter part of that year where we expect inflation then to start easing.
OK. Treasury said it could compromise IRD's workforce, which is already stretched. They're the ones that have to administer it. They also said that no other government agencies were consulted because it was a bit rushed. Does this not play into the opposition's hands that it does look like Bandaid economics made up on the fly?
Not at all. I mean, the first thing I'd say, Ryan, is that as you can hear, we were working on ways to ease these impacts as early as at the end of last year. But of course, as we've seen in other economies, the increase in inflation has been significant over a very short period of time. And so the alternative is not to respond to that. But keep in mind, the reason we've done something that is targeted and short-term is because Treasury also raised there was the potential for the payment, if it was longer-term, to have an inflationary impact, to actually make the problem worse. So we didn't want to do that either. And that's why, unlike the National Party, who, their proposal gives less to low and middle income New Zealanders, but also would be inflationary because it is not targeted in short term. So that's why we designed this alternative.
When will Kiwis start to get ahead under Labour?
Well, Ryan, you know, because I've said it repeatedly on here, that this doesn't change where people are right now, which is a tough place. But actually, since 2017, wages and wage growth in New Zealand has been growing at a faster rate, at a higher rate, than the cost of living
since we came into
office and until this year. Then it changes back next year. In the budget forecast, you'll see the prediction is that in 2023 we get back to that position of wages growing faster than the increase in cost of living. We just happen to be in a very difficult moment here and now.
So 2023. Allied health workers.
2023, yeah.
Psychologists in particular I want to talk about, because there's the whole mental health, crisis that we find ourselves in. And this strike, the psychologists were being offered, according to the union, about half of the increase in inflation over the last few years. So they're going backwards. Are these not the people we want to be keeping?
So the allied health workers, and so without speaking to some of the individual occupation groups, the allied health workers, from memory, there's roughly, I believe, over 100 occupation groups within that allied health workforce. So it's a very large group, from technicians, I believe some of our public health specialists are in there, psychologists, very wide-ranging group that are currently in negotiations. They've been through facilitation. Everyone's working in earnest to resolve the pay negotiations. One of the extra layers of complication is that there's a pay equity. Pay equity's been thrown into the mix as well. And of course, that requires a very distinct process. So look, it's all being worked through. It's not yet being finalised, but of course, we hope to see resolution for everyone as soon as possible.
I would hope so, yeah. Just very quickly before you go, because I know you're going to be meeting with some tech bosses presumably in Silicon Valley. So the Christchurch call was 3 years ago now, and your opponents took a pot shot at you at the time and said, oh, this is a photo op with Macron in Paris and all that kind of stuff. 2 weeks ago, we spoke on this program to Eric Feinberg, who's with the Coalition for a Safer Web. He told us that 3 years on, there are still a dozen copies of that terrorist video on Facebook and Instagram.
Well, look, the first thing I would say, Ryan, is that actually, unfortunately, we're continuing to see the real-world test of what the Christchurch call to action has delivered. And it is a vastly different environment now than when New Zealand had their horrific experience on the 15th of March, where you saw that act live stream and then the mass proliferation of copies across the internet and access to it. We saw recently another live-streamed event, vastly different response. And that's because one of the things that's happened as a result of the work of the Christchurch call to action is we have now an international crisis protocol, which almost means that there's almost an international civil defence style response. So this protocol kicks in as soon as an event like this happens. Takedown in the most recent example, my recollection was 2 minutes. The proliferation was vastly different to what we experienced. So does it mean that you see zero? No, because of course it's the internet. It is incredibly difficult to get back down to that, but it is vastly different than what we experienced. But Ryan, the goal of the Christchurch call was not just in that space. It was around also greater transparency around a whole lot of other areas, algorithmic practice and so on. And so there is more work that's ongoing, but we also now have permanent institutions and structures that exist that did not exist when New Zealand had its experience.
All right. Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. Best of luck with your trip to the States.
Thanks.
Go get him, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.